England, 1819. The spring morning arrived with the particular softness that belonged only to the Cotswolds, where mist clung to the valley floors, like wisps of forgotten dreams, and the air carried the scent of wild roses beginning their annual resurrection. In the small cottage that stood at the edge of Castlewood village, nestled between an ancient oak and an overgrown garden that had long since claimed its independence from human design, a woman moved through her morning rituals with the practiced efficiency of one who had learned to find contentment in solitude. Harriet Dowling, though that was not the name she had been born to, set the kettle over the fire and watched as steam began to rise in lazy spirals toward the blackened ceiling beams. 5 years she had lived in this cottage. 5 years since she had fled London with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart so thoroughly shattered that she had believed it incapable of ever mending. The village knew her as the widow Dowling, a quiet woman of perhaps 28 years who kept bees, sold honey at the market, and asked nothing of anyone beyond the occasional purchase of flour or tea. She attended church on Sundays, sitting always in the back pew, and nodded politely to her neighbours without ever encouraging the intimacy that might lead to questions about her past. Mrs. Hales, the baker's wife, had tried in those early months to draw her into the complex social fabric of village life, but Harriet had perfected the art of gentle refusal, of declining invitations with such apologetic grace that even the most persistent gossip eventually accepted her desire for privacy. The cottage itself bore the marks of Harriet's 5 years of habitation, transformed from the near ruin she had discovered into something approaching comfort. She had patched the roof herself, learning through trial and considerable error, had replaced the broken windows with glass she could ill afford, had planted the kitchen garden that now provided most of her sustenance. The work had been hard, her hands unaccustomed to such labour, but she had welcomed the exhaustion that came each evening, the way it drove thought from her mind and allowed her the mercy of dreamless sleep. Her days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Morning inspection of the hives, careful harvest of honey when the combs were ready, preparation of the jars she would sell, tending to the garden, mending her few garments, reading by firelight the books she borrowed from the vicar's modest library. It was a small life, a quiet life, and if there were moments when she stood at her window, watching carriages pass on the distant road and felt the weight of all she had lost pressing against her chest like a physical thing, she had learned to breathe through such moments until they passed. She did not allow herself to think of London, of the ballrooms where she had once danced, of the family she had left behind, of the scandal that had driven her from everything she had known. That life belonged to someone else, to Lady Harriet Sinclair, daughter of the Earl of Redbury, a woman who no longer existed except perhaps in the fading memories of those who had witnessed her disgrace. The woman who remained, who called herself Mrs. Dowling and kept bees and lived alone in a cottage at the edge of nowhere, was someone entirely different, someone who had been forged in the crucible of shame and survival into something harder and more solitary than the girl she had been. It was this woman, this careful construct of widow and beekeeper, who stood in her garden on that particular spring morning, inspecting the early roses that climbed the cottage wall when she heard the sound of horses approaching on the lane. She looked up, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and felt her heart perform an uncomfortable lurch as an elegant travelling carriage drawn by 4 matched bays came into view. The vehicle was far too fine for this rural lane, speaking of wealth and privilege that had no business in a place like Castlewood village, and as it slowed to a halt directly before her cottage gate, Harriet felt the familiar sensation of fear tightening around her throat. From the carriage descended a man whose bearing proclaimed his rank as clearly as any herald's announcement. Tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 35 years of age, he wore travelling clothes of such evident quality that Harriet knew immediately he must be nobility. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face, as he turned to survey the cottage and its overgrown garden, held the kind of austere handsomeness that spoke of good breeding and considerable self-possession. Behind him, a servant emerged from the carriage, carrying what appeared to be a leather portfolio, awaiting his master's instructions with the patience of long practice. Harriet's first instinct was to retreat into the cottage, to hide as she had hidden for 5 years from anything that might connect her to her former life. But the man's gaze had already found her, his grey eyes fixing upon her face with an intensity that made movement suddenly impossible. For a long moment they stared at each other across the garden gate, and Harriet saw something shift in his expression, recognition dawning like sunrise across his features. He knows, she thought with a terror so profound it made her dizzy. Somehow he knows who I am. The man moved toward the gate with purpose, his hand already reaching for the latch, and Harriet found her voice at last. "You are mistaken in your direction, sir," she said, pleased that her words emerged steady despite the trembling that had seized her limbs. "There is nothing here that would interest a gentleman of your station. The village proper lies a 1/4 mile down the road." He paused, his hand resting on the gate, and studied her with an expression she could not interpret. "Mrs. Dowling, I presume," he said, and his voice was deep and cultured, carrying the accent of the highest circles of society. "I am not mistaken in my direction, madam. I have been searching for this cottage specifically, and for its occupant." Harriet's breath caught. No one should know her assumed name. No one should have any reason to seek her in this forgotten corner of England. She had been so careful, had covered her tracks so thoroughly in her flight from London 5 years ago. "I do not know what you want," she said, her voice harder now, edged with the desperation of a cornered creature. "But I must ask you to leave. I receive no visitors, and I have no business with strangers." The man opened the gate despite her words, stepping into the garden with the unconscious authority of one accustomed to having his wishes accommodated. His servant remained by the carriage, a discreet distance away, but clearly prepared to intervene if necessary. "My name is Adrian Buxton, Duke of Castlewood," he said, and Harriet felt the world tilt beneath her feet at the pronunciation of that title. The Duke of Castlewood, whose lands encompassed thousands of acres, including, she realised with dawning horror, likely this very village and the cottage where she had believed herself safely hidden. "And you, madam, despite your protestations, are Lady Harriet Sinclair, daughter of the Earl of Redbury, who disappeared from London 5 years ago under circumstances that remain the subject of considerable speculation." Harriet's carefully constructed world shattered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She had known this moment might come, had nightmares of discovery that left her gasping awake in the dark hours before dawn, but the reality of it was somehow both worse and different than anything she had imagined. Her first thought was to deny everything, to insist he was mistaken, but something in his steady gaze told her such deception would be futile. "You are mistaken," she tried anyway, the lie feeling thin and transparent even as she spoke it. "Lady Harriet Sinclair is dead. Everyone knows this. There was a fire and her body was never recovered, but she is presumed dead these 5 years past." Adrian took another step closer, his expression softening into something that might have been compassion. "There was indeed a fire at the townhouse where you were staying, and in the chaos of that night, a young woman's body was found burned beyond recognition. But I have reason to believe that body was not yours, that you used the tragedy as an opportunity to disappear, to escape the scandal that had engulfed you." Tears burned in Harriet's eyes, treacherous things that she had not permitted herself in years, and she turned away from him, her hands gripping the rough stone of the cottage wall. "If you know who I was, then you know I cannot return to that life. The scandal you mentioned destroyed everything. My reputation, my family's standing, my very name became synonymous with shame. I chose, death over facing that world again, and I do not regret it. Please your grace, if you have any mercy, you will leave this place, and forget you ever found me. Let me remain dead to that world." She heard him move closer, his footsteps soft on the garden path, and when he spoke again his voice was near enough that she could feel his breath stir her hair. "I cannot do that, Lady Harriet, because the scandal that drove you into hiding was built upon lies, and I have spent the better part of 3 years uncovering evidence that proves your innocence in the matter for which you were condemned." Harriet turned to face him, searching his expression for deceit or cruelty, and finding neither. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "I mean that Lord Marcus Sedley, my cousin and your former fiancé, orchestrated an elaborate deception to destroy your reputation when you attempted to end your engagement after discovering his true character. The compromising situation in which you were discovered, the witnesses who testified to your infidelity, the letters that were presented as evidence of an affair, all of it was fabricated by Marcus to ruin you so thoroughly that no one would credit your accusations against him." The words struck Harriet like physical blows, each revelation tearing open wounds she had thought long since scarred over. She had been engaged to Lord Marcus Sedley 5 years ago, a match celebrated by both families as brilliant and advantageous. But in the weeks before their wedding, she had discovered that Marcus was not the gentleman he pretended to be, had learned of his gambling debts that threatened to consume both their fortunes, had witnessed his capacity for cruelty when he believed himself unobserved. When she had tried to end the engagement, when she had gone to her father with evidence of Marcus's character, he had struck back with devastating efficiency. Within a week, she had been discovered in what appeared to be a compromising situation with another man. Letters had surfaced suggesting an affair. Witnesses had come forward to testify to her wanton behaviour. Her father, humiliated and enraged, had demanded she marry Marcus immediately to salvage what remained of her reputation, and when she had refused, when she had continued to insist that Marcus had orchestrated everything to force her compliance, she had been called mad and confined to the townhouse with plans to send her to an asylum. The fire that night had been terrible and tragic, claiming the life of a maid who had been in Harriet's room, but it had also provided Harriet with an opportunity she had seized with the desperation of one who had nothing left to lose. She had fled into the night, had taken what money she could gather, and had disappeared into the vastness of England, eventually finding her way to this cottage where she had believed herself beyond the reach of her past. "How did you discover all of this?" she asked, her voice breaking on the words. "And why would you care to investigate a scandal that is 5 years old and involves a woman presumed dead?" Adrian's expression grew sombre. "Because Marcus attempted to play similar games with my sister 2 years ago, and in investigating his character to protect her, I uncovered evidence of his schemes against you. Letters he had written to the man he paid to compromise you, records of payments to false witnesses, drafts of the letters he had forged in your hand. I have spent the past year gathering irrefutable proof of his deception, but I could not clear your name while you remained missing, presumed dead. When I inherited the title 6 months ago after my father's death, I gained access to estate records that revealed a cottage on Castlewood lands rented to a Mrs. Dowling, a widow who appeared from nowhere 5 years ago with no family and no history. The coincidence of timing was too precise to ignore, and when I made inquiries and received descriptions of the widow Dowling, I knew I had found you." Harriet felt as though the earth had shifted beneath her feet, as though the careful life she had built over 5 years was dissolving like morning mist. "Even if what you say is true, even if Marcus did fabricate everything, I cannot return to London, cannot face that society again. The shame of it would destroy me." "The shame belongs to Marcus, not to you," Adrian said firmly, "and I will ensure that every person who condemned you 5 years ago knows the truth of what happened. Marcus will face the consequences of his actions, and you will have your name and your place in society restored. This I swear to you." Harriet shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself as though she could hold together the pieces of the person she had become. "You do not understand, Your Grace. I do not want that life back. I have built something here, small though it may be. I have peace. I have purpose. I have freedom from the judgment and cruelty of that world. I would rather remain Harriet Dowling, beekeeper, than return to being Lady Harriet Sinclair, disgraced daughter and object of pity." Adrian regarded her with an expression that held both understanding and determination. "I hear what you are saying, and I respect the life you have created here, but you deserve the choice of who you wish to be rather than having that choice stolen from you by Marcus's deception. Let me help you reclaim your name, your family, your rightful place, and if after that you choose to return to this cottage and this life, I will respect that decision. But make that choice from a position of freedom, rather than continued hiding." Before Harriet could respond, the sound of another carriage approaching drew their attention. This vehicle was less elegant than the Duke's, a hired conveyance that spoke of London origins, and as it came to a halt behind Adrian's carriage, a man descended whose face Harriet recognised with a jolt of pure terror. Lord Marcus Sedley had changed little in 5 years, still possessed of the cold handsomeness that had initially blinded her to his true nature, still moving with the casual arrogance of one who believed himself untouchable. His eyes swept the scene before him, taking in Adrian standing in Harriet's garden, and his expression shifted into something calculating and dangerous. "Cousin," Marcus said, his voice carrying false warmth, "I had wondered where you had disappeared to. When you left London so abruptly, I grew concerned that some urgent business required your attention. I see now that you were pursuing rumours and fairy tales." Adrian's posture changed subtly, his body positioning itself between Harriet and Marcus in a gesture that was unmistakably protective. "The only fairy tale here, Marcus, is the fiction you created 5 years ago to destroy an innocent woman's reputation. I have found evidence of your deception, documented proof that you fabricated the entire scandal that drove Lady Harriet into hiding. Your schemes are finished." Marcus's laugh held no warmth. "Lady Harriet is dead, cousin, burned in a fire 5 years ago. Whatever woman you have found in this cottage, she is clearly an impostor attempting to capitalise on resemblance to extract money or advantage from you. I am surprised you would be taken in by such an obvious deception." Harriet felt Adrian tense beside her, his voice dropping to a tone of cold fury. "We both know the truth, Marcus. Lady Harriet survived the fire you likely orchestrated as a final attempt to silence her, and she has been living here in peace for 5 years while you continued your various schemes. But your actions caught up with you when you attempted similar deception with my sister, and in investigating that matter, I uncovered everything you did to Lady Harriet. I have letters in your own hand, records of payments, testimony from men you suborned to lie. Your guilt is beyond question." Marcus's expression hardened, all pretense of civility dropping away to reveal the cruelty beneath. "Even if you have such evidence, who will believe it? I am a lord, a member of the Sedley family, a man of standing and reputation. This woman is nothing, a peasant who keeps bees in a cottage and claims to be someone she is not. I will say she and you concocted this entire story to extract money from me, and society will believe me over her. They always believe the man over the woman, cousin. Surely you know this by now." It was Harriet who spoke then, stepping forward despite her fear, years of silence and hiding giving way to a fury she had not known she still possessed. "You stole my life," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You destroyed my reputation, poisoned my relationships with my family, drove me into exile because I dared to see your true character and refused to marry you. You would have condemned me to an asylum or worse to maintain your deception, and when I escaped, you let everyone believe I was dead rather than risk me speaking the truth. But I am not dead, Marcus, and I will not remain silent any longer. Whatever consequences come from speaking, I will bear them, because living in truth is worth more than all the peace I have found in hiding. Marcus took a step toward her, his hand raised as though he might strike, but Adrian moved with sudden violence, seizing Marcus's wrist and twisting it back with a force that made the other man cry out. "You will not touch her," Adrian said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will not come near her. You will not speak to her. You will not so much as look at her, or I will personally ensure that you face charges of assault, in addition to fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Your schemes end here, Marcus, and you will answer for every cruelty you have committed." The confrontation might have escalated further, but the sound of more horses approaching drew their attention. A party of riders came into view, led by a man whose resemblance to Harriet was so marked that Adrian immediately identified him as her brother. Behind him rode two other gentlemen and a woman whose elegant bearing suggested nobility, and as they drew to a halt and dismounted, Harriet felt her legs give way beneath her. Her brother James, now the Earl of Redbury since their father's death 3 years ago, crossed the garden in swift strides and knelt beside where Harriet had collapsed against the cottage wall. His face, aged by grief and responsibility since she had last seen him, held an expression of such profound relief and joy that Harriet began to weep in earnest. "Harriet," he breathed, his hands cupping her face as though to reassure himself she was real. "My God, Harriet, we thought you dead, mourned you, and all this time you have been alive and hiding here. The Duke sent word that he had found you, that he had proof of Marcus's deception, and I rode through the night to reach you. Forgive me, sister. Forgive us all for not believing you 5 years ago, for failing to protect you from that monster." Harriet clung to her brother, 5 years of loneliness and exile breaking over her in waves as she felt his arms around her, solid and real, and offering the familial love she had believed forever lost to her. The other riders had surrounded Marcus, preventing any attempt at escape, and Adrian was speaking in low tones with one of the gentlemen about legal proceedings and evidence. The woman, whom Harriet recognised now as the Duchess of Wellington, was approaching with a cloak that she draped around Harriet's shoulders with maternal tenderness. The remainder of that day passed in a blur of revelation and reunion. James explained that their father had died 3 years ago, his heart broken by Harriet's presumed death and by the growing suspicion that he had condemned her unjustly. Their mother, now living quietly in Bath, had never stopped believing Harriet was innocent, had never stopped hoping that somehow her daughter lived. When Adrian had approached James with evidence of Marcus's deception and the suggestion that Harriet might still be alive, hidden on Castlewood lands, James had gathered allies and ridden immediately to confront Marcus and reclaim his sister. Marcus himself was taken into custody by a magistrate who had accompanied the party, the evidence against him so overwhelming that even his protests of innocence rang hollow. He would face trial for fraud and conspiracy, and while his noble birth might protect him from the harshest punishments, his reputation was destroyed beyond repair. But Harriet found she took little satisfaction in his downfall, too overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her circumstances to focus on revenge. As evening approached, and her cottage filled with people whose presence would have been unthinkable mere hours ago, Harriet found herself seeking the garden's solitude, needing air and space to process everything that had occurred. She stood among her roses, the blooms she had tended for 5 years, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down upon her. Adrian found her there as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. He approached slowly, giving her space to refuse his presence if she wished, but Harriet found she was grateful for his company, for the steady calm he projected. "You are overwhelmed," he observed, coming to stand beside her but not touching, respecting the distance she seemed to need. "Your brother wishes to take you back to London tomorrow, to reunite you with your mother and begin the process of restoring your place in society. The Duchess of Wellington has offered her sponsorship, which will go far in ensuring society accepts your return. Marcus's guilt is so evident that no one will question your innocence once the facts are known." Harriet nodded, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the evening. "I should be grateful, and I am grateful, but I find myself terrified in ways I cannot fully articulate. This life I have built here is small and constrained, but it is mine, earned through my own labour, answerable to no one. The life I left behind was one of constant judgment, of having my worth measured by standards I could never control. I do not know if I can return to that world, even with my name cleared." Adrian was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quality of careful consideration. "What if you did not have to choose? What if you could have both the restoration of your name and family and the freedom and independence you have found here?" Harriet turned to look at him, confusion evident in her expression. "I do not understand. How could both be possible?" He met her gaze steadily, and she saw in his eyes something that made her breath catch. "I came here today intending only to offer you justice, to restore what Marcus had stolen. But standing here, in your garden, seeing the life you have created through courage and determination, I find myself wanting to offer more. Marry me, Harriet. Not immediately, not until you are ready, but agree to consider the possibility. As my Duchess, you would have freedom few women ever know, resources to pursue whatever interests you choose, protection from the judgment and cruelty of society. You could maintain this cottage if you wished, could divide your time between London and the countryside, could live according to your own design rather than society's expectations." Harriet stared at him, certain she must have misheard. "You cannot be serious. We have known each other mere hours. You know nothing of me beyond my history of scandal." "I know you are brave enough to choose death and exile over compromising your principles," Adrian replied. "I know you have survived 5 years alone through determination and resourcefulness. I know you value truth over convenience and freedom over security. I know that looking at you makes me believe that perhaps the heart I thought permanently closed might yet be capable of opening again. These things seem sufficient foundation for a marriage, particularly one between two people who have both learned that pretty lies and social performance mean far less than genuine character." Harriet felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the tears of earlier, carrying hope rather than despair. "You said your heart was closed. What did you mean?" Adrian's expression softened with memory and old pain. "I was married once, years ago, to a woman chosen by our families for advantageous connection rather than affection. She died giving birth to our stillborn son, and I have carried the guilt of that loss for 8 years, believing that if I had loved her better, if I had refused the marriage in the first place, if I had been wiser and kinder, she might have survived. I closed myself off after her death, devoted myself to duty and responsibility, and determined never to risk such pain again. But discovering your story, seeing how Marcus destroyed your life and how you survived despite everything, has reminded me that safety purchased through isolation is not truly living." Harriet reached out slowly, giving him time to withdraw if he wished, and took his hand in hers. His fingers closed around hers with a warmth that felt like coming home, and she felt something in her chest, long frozen, begin to thaw. "I cannot promise to love you," she said honestly. "Not yet. Perhaps not for a long time. 5 years of solitude has taught me to guard my heart carefully, and I do not know if I remember how to trust anyone beyond myself." "Then we shall learn together," Adrian replied, slowly, at whatever pace feels safe for you, with no expectations beyond honest companionship and mutual respect. "I will not pressure you or rush you or demand more than you are willing to give. But I will also not leave you to face the challenges ahead alone, unless you wish it. That much I can promise absolutely." They stood in the garden as stars began to appear. Overhead, two wounded souls who had found each other through the most improbable of circumstances, and Harriet felt the shape of her future shifting into something she could not quite yet imagine, but that no longer filled her only with fear. The cottage behind them glowed with lamplight where her brother and the others waited, and beyond that lay London and society and all the complicated work of restoration and revenge. But for this moment she allowed herself simply to stand in her garden, holding the hand of a man who had given her back the possibility of choice. Over the weeks that followed, Harriet's world transformed in ways both wonderful and terrifying. James took her first to Bath to reunite with their mother, a meeting so emotional that both women wept for hours, years of grief and guilt and joy mingling until exhaustion finally overtook them. Lady Redbury had aged in the years of Harriet's absence, her hair gone silver and her face marked with lines of sorrow, but the love she showed her daughter was unchanged, and in her arms Harriet found the acceptance she had believed forever lost. The revelation of Marcus's deception spread through society with the speed of wildfire, amplified by Adrian's position and the Duchess of Wellington's influential voice. The evidence he had gathered was shared selectively but decisively with key figures, and the narrative that had condemned Harriet 5 years ago was systematically dismantled and replaced with truth. Some who had judged her most harshly now rushed to offer apologies, while others had the grace to remain silent in their shame. Marcus himself faced trial, and, though his noble birth protected him from prison, was stripped of his honours and exiled to his estates, with his reputation destroyed beyond repair. But Harriet found that revenge brought little satisfaction compared to the simple joy of being reunited with her family, and slowly, carefully, building a relationship with Adrian that defied all her expectations. He was patient beyond what she had thought possible, calling upon her regularly, but never presuming intimacy, engaging her in conversation about books and ideas and the management of estates, seeking her opinion and genuinely listening to her responses. He did not press her about marriage, did not demand declarations of feeling, simply remained a steady presence in her life as she navigated the complex process of reclaiming her identity. They returned together to the cottage several times, Adrian accompanying her when she needed to tend her bees or simply escape the overwhelming attention that came with her return to society. He hired a local woman to maintain the property when Harriet was in London, and made improvements to the structure that Harriet had not been able to afford, but he did so only with her permission, respecting her ownership of the space in ways that made her feel valued rather than managed. It was during one of these visits, nearly 3 months after their first meeting, that Harriet found herself watching Adrian work alongside her in the garden, his elegant clothes protected by a rough apron as he helped her harvest honey, and realised with a start that she had fallen in love with him without quite noticing when it had happened. The revelation was both thrilling and terrifying, and she said nothing of it that day, but she thought he must have sensed some shift in her because his eyes, when they met hers, held a warmth that made her breath catch. 2 weeks later, back in London during a ball held in Harriet's honour to celebrate her restoration to society, Adrian found her on a terrace overlooking the gardens and asked if she had reached any conclusions about his proposal from those months ago. Harriet looked at him, This man who had given her back her name and her family while also giving her the freedom to choose her own path, and felt a certainty that transcended all her fears. "I have reached several conclusions," she said, moving closer to him. "The first is that I love you, though I cannot say exactly when I fell, or how it happened so gradually I did not notice until it was complete. The second is that I would very much like to marry you, if the offer still stands. The third is that I want our life together to be built on truth rather than pretty fictions. So I must tell you that I am still frightened sometimes, still struggle with trusting that this happiness will not be stolen from me, still have nightmares about the past." Adrian's smile transformed his austere features into something radiant. "The offer not only stands but has been waiting with increasing impatience for exactly this answer. As for your fears and struggles, I would expect nothing less from someone who survived what you have endured. We will face them together, and I will spend every day proving to you that this happiness is real and permanent, and yours by right rather than by chance." He kissed her then, a gentle touch that deepened into something more passionate as Harriet responded with 5 years of loneliness and longing finally finding expression. Around them the ball continued, society's dance proceeding with its usual rhythms. But for that moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, two wounded hearts learning to beat in synchrony. They married 6 weeks later in a quiet ceremony at the cottage, with only family and closest friends in attendance. Harriet wore a dress of cream silk rather than traditional white, and carried roses from her own garden. And when she spoke her vows, her voice was clear and strong. No longer the frightened girl who had fled into the night 5 years ago, but a woman who knew her own worth and had chosen freely where to bestow her love. Adrian's vows in return were simple but profound, promises of partnership and respect and devotion spoken with a sincerity that left no room for doubt. The years that followed exceeded anything Harriet had dared to imagine during those dark days of hiding. As Duchess of Castlewood, she used her position and resources to establish a network of safe houses for women fleeing dangerous situations, drawing on her own experience to create the kind of refuge she had needed 5 years ago. Adrian supported her work without reservation, using his influence to protect and fund her projects, and together they became known throughout England for their progressive approaches to social reform. They divided their time between London, Adrian's primary estate in Yorkshire, and the cottage in the Cotswolds that remained Harriet's sanctuary. She continued to keep bees, teaching Adrian the craft and eventually their children, and found that the skills she had developed during her years of hiding served her well in her new life. The self-sufficiency and resilience she had cultivated out of necessity became strengths she could offer to others facing similar challenges. Her mother lived long enough to see Harriet happy and secure, to know her 3 grandchildren, to take comfort in the knowledge that her daughter had not only survived, but thrived. James became one of Adrian's closest friends and political allies, their bond forged through the crisis that had brought Harriet back into their lives. Even the Duchess of Wellington remained a devoted friend and supporter, her sponsorship having been the beginning of a genuine affection that lasted decades. As for Marcus, Harriet thought of him rarely as the years passed, and when she did, it was without the consuming anger she had once felt. He lived out his exile in obscurity, his name synonymous with deception and cruelty, but Harriet found she had no energy to spare for hatred when her life was so full of love and purpose. She had learned during her years in hiding that resentment was a burden she could not afford, and that lesson served her well in building her future. 20 years after that spring morning when Adrian had appeared at her cottage gate, Harriet stood in the same garden, now beautifully maintained but retaining its essential wildness, and watched as her eldest daughter worked with the bees under Adrian's patient instruction. Their son was away at university, their youngest still in the schoolroom, and Harriet felt a contentment so profound It sometimes made her breathless. Adrian came to stand beside her, his hair now more silver than dark, but his bearing still strong and commanding, and slipped his arm around her waist in the familiar gesture that never failed to make her feel cherished. "What are you thinking?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I am thinking about the woman I was when you first found me," Harriet replied, leaning into his embrace. "How terrified I was of being discovered, of having to face the world again, of losing the small, safe life I had built. I am thinking how grateful I am that you refused to leave, that you insisted I deserved better than hiding, that you gave me back not just my name, but the possibility of living rather than merely surviving." "I am the one who should be grateful," Adrian said softly. "You taught me that a heart can heal even after it believes itself permanently broken, that love is worth the risk of loss, that true partnership means honouring another person's strength rather than trying to control or diminish it. You have given me more than I ever dreamed of having." They stood together as the afternoon sun painted their garden in gold, and their daughter's laugh rang out clear and joyful, a sound that carried the promise of generations to come who would never know the particular sorrows their parents had survived, but would benefit from the wisdom earned through that survival. Harriet had lived many lives: the naive girl engaged to a monster, the disgraced woman fled into exile, the solitary widow who kept bees and asked nothing of anyone, and finally the duchess who had learned that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in hiding from the world, but in allowing oneself to be found. And of all those lives, this one, built on truth and choice and hard-won trust, was the one she would have chosen had the choice been hers from the beginning. The cottage behind them stood as testament to her years of solitude, but it no longer represented exile or loss. Instead, it had become a symbol of resilience and transformation, of the truth that even the darkest circumstances could give birth to strength, and that being found by the right person at the right moment could change the entire trajectory of a life. For Harriet had been hiding for 5 years when the Duke found her, and his refusal to leave had been the beginning of everything that mattered most in the world she had built since. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking transformation. Help us reach more listeners who need to hear that healing is possible, that second chances exist, and that being truly seen can change everything. At the end of this video, you will see a suggestion for another of our historical romance stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale of love conquering even the deepest wounds. With all our gratitude, Courting Tales.